Hi, and welcome back to All Truth is God's Truth. If you're joining us this week, we are once again diving into a fairly controversial topic. We're going to be looking specifically at some of the key evidence that's typically presented in favor of evolution. But we're also going to take a peek at some of the evidence that suggests maybe evolution isn't the whole picture, or maybe it's not even possible at all. This week, like last week, I have a number of graphics and illustrations that go along with this lesson, and you can find those at our website, atigtpodcast.com. Thanks for joining us, and let's dive in. We are doing creation and evolution again. Last week, we looked at some of the arguments in favor of evolutionary theory. In particular, tried to clarify kind of the actual kind of statistical reasoning behind evolutionary theory. Today, I'm going to present a little bit of additional evidence, a lot of it fossil-based, and then we'll switch over and actually kind of take a step back and maybe critique it a bit. And hopefully that'll finish us off on the actual science part of creation and evolution. After that, we'll dive into other weird aspects pertaining to the first few chapters of Genesis, but I think we'll be done with science for now. All right, so what evidence is there that evolution has occurred? I think there is significant evidence that some form of biological progression has occurred. In particular, the fact that there are a significant number of species that just no longer exist. Dinosaurs are the super famous case, right? So that's an easy one to pull out of your pocket. But there's lots of others out there too. Trilobites being kind of the archetypal, like really early life form that looks almost alien to us, but we don't find those in the ocean anymore. And they seem to have been all over the place before. So at the very least, that suggests, okay, well then there are either dramatically fewer species than there used to be, or new species have emerged to take their place. And the fossil evidence, I think, pretty clearly indicates, or at least suggests so far, that yeah, it does kind of look like new species appeared, and that the dinosaurs were pegging at 65 million years. But you don't find dinosaurs before that, really. The trilobites, we're talking 250 million years ago. There's a good 200-ish million years in there where trilobites have been around and there's no dinosaurs yet, and then suddenly dinosaurs appear. That's not necessarily a full theory of evolution, but somehow you got to account for that. Maybe I'll just go ahead and toss it back out. Last week, the methods for dating all these layers, etc., they're open to scrutiny. I think they should be open to scrutiny. I think they're probably pretty good, but I don't think we need to just say those are definitely ironclad and we can never question them at all. I think that's a dogmatic position that we don't need to take as scientists. But as thinkers, so that suggests, I guess, something about progression, or maybe progression is even too strong of a word, but transition, transformation, something. Things seem different at different points in the fossil layers. Okay.
Is it safe to say that is all based on the fact that they're in different layers? We can say that they're in different layers, but that's really all I can say definitively, right? We can't say for sure that the time is different. That's what it's based on, right? Layers.
Yes, layers, and then the radiometric dating of the igneous layers that bound those. So if you find trilobites underneath something that you radiometrically date to be 100 million years old, and then you find somewhere else, or even in the same place, dinosaurs above a layer that you date to be 100 million years old, somehow you got to account for the fact that either you've dated that layer really wrong, and you don't understand those processes right, or if the conventional explanation is correct, then there's at least some kind of significant time period separating those two. At least enough that a lava flow could cover up the territory, and then a different set of species appear. Oh, yes, Paul.
Yeah, I would also add to that you can explain some anomalies with it because of geological processes. Like there was a fault and then there's a slide.
Yeah.
So then you get layers that look like they're the same age, but they're at different depths, right? Or if there was erosion, and then you have sedimentation again, then there could be a gap.
Yeah.
So what happened during that gap?
Certainly the fossil record is not complete, right? Yeah, it's not a nice continuous progression of layers with no breaks and no.
Some
gaps.
parts are, and some parts aren't.
Yeah. No, the labor of trying to piece together the story is clearly a monumental work to do it, and it's probably undersold because you want to present this as like, we figured it out. Here's the story. Here's the progression. We have all the pieces fit into the puzzle, and maybe many of the pieces are in the right place, but the work to get there is monumental. Yeah. I think that's enough for us to go, okay, open to continued scrutiny, but not enough for us, I think, to just toss it out and say, well, it's really hard, so it's probably wrong. Anyway. Okay. Other common arguments. So I promised last week, before I failed to get to this portion, that I was going to present what's typically shown as the strongest case for evolution that you can make. I say this having literally Googled the best case for evolution, over and over, and dug around as many different sources.
Come on, you didn't use ChatGPT.
Oh, that's true. That could have just told me. The resources, disparate as they were, they all converged on the same 6 examples. So that's what I'm going to show you, because apparently that's the stuff that all the biologists go to as their poster children. So one of them is vestigial organs. I've shown 2 examples here. Blind fish in caves. There are certain caves, especially around Mexico, where the fish populations, they're blind. Now that kind of makes sense. They don't need eyes. There's no light down there, so it doesn't offer any advantage. But the fish just outside the cave, they look awfully similar in a lot of ways, but they're not blind. And it makes sense, not being blind outside the cave probably helps them a lot. Some people might consider that more like, oh, well, that's microevolution. Because look, the fish look the same, but there's been enough something that it looks like fish that, they even have the skeletal structure to fit eyeballs in there. They don't have eyes anymore. Or at least that would be the narrative proposes, that they used to have eyes probably, they wandered in the cave, they kind of settled in, and now that they had some means of navigating and eating in the cave that didn't rely on eyesight, the part that's often glossed over is that shouldn't actually do anything. Having the eyes doesn't make a difference. It doesn't help, but it doesn't hurt. Unless the argument usually goes that, well, it probably does hurt, because your body has to expend energy building those eyes. And so fish that don't build eyes are offered an advantage in that they don't have to find as much food. That would be the necessary component if you're going to say somehow nature is selecting for blind fish. Otherwise, it should just be indifferent and it shouldn't care, and half the fish should be blind and half shouldn't, or something like that. But there's no preference for blindness in a cave, unless somehow having eyeballs actually does cost you something. But a vestigial organ like that looks like maybe it used to have eyes. Now it doesn't. So what's the story there? Evolutionary biologists would say, well, they did used to have eyes and now they don't because their current circumstances don't require it. Similarly, when you look at a whale, whales are literally, I found a paper by a whale paleontologist. It just says cetaceans, which is biology for whales. Cetaceans, the poster children for evolution and transitionary fossils. So they consider this literally the poster child. And they are a weird group of species in that they're water mammals. I think it's very fair to call them mammals. They're warm-blooded. They give birth to live young. They breathe air with lungs like us instead of gills. They feed milk to their young. They do all the things that otherwise we require a thing to do to call it a mammal. But it's living in the water. And the evolutionary story, as probably many of you have heard, is that was a land mammal that evolved over time to live in the water, and thus now has no need for hind legs, but used to have them, and that you can see the vestiges of that in this pelvic structure here. Do I call it out? I don't. Well, anyway, right here, there's a set of bones that kind of look like a pelvis sort thing. looks like maybe attached to legs at one point, and they go, well, that bone's not doing them any good. Why is it there? Unless they descended from species that used to have really good use for those bones. So we're going to dive into the whale. Before we do, though, a few notes on what we'll see in transitionary fossils. This is Darwin's tree of life. I know last week I promised I didn't think Darwin was trying to be too inflammatory when he kind of accidentally set the world on fire. Naming this the tree of life was probably the most inflammatory thing he did, or one of the more inflammatory things, because obviously that's a biblical allusion to the origin of life on Earth. Whereas
I heard someone say it's because if you named it the evolution of species, it wouldn't have been nearly what he called it the origin of species. And all of a sudden everyone's like,
interesting.
If you just called it the evolution of species, they'd be like, yeah. You know, like,
Yeah. I do think that's actually the right title for it, because the trick is not how does one species gradually change into another, but how do new species appear where there used to be none. I think that's the harder part for the evolutionary theorist to explain. And so that's what I think he was trying to answer. But yeah, you're right. It does. It's like, oh, wait, if you're talking about the origin of how things got to be here, that's a much more sensitive kind of, you're talking about me and my origins and all that. Gets dicier faster. But anyway, this is Darwin's tree of life, in which he's trying to show from the bottom some, set of 10 or so theoretical ancestors of species that are around today, A through L. And each of them, have descendants that branch off into some species. These little spokes you see that just last a little bit, those are supposed to be new species that arise and then quickly go extinct. They're not very good at what they do. They maybe exist for a while, but they're just not the best, and so they die out. But then, the ones that do go on, they go on to produce new species, et cetera, in this ever-branching tree. So that's what Darwin's trying to illustrate here. There are some species, he argues, that are, in fact, they were around many millions of years ago, and they're still around today, basically unchanged. There's a fish, coelacanth, I think, that is a good example, or crocodile, things like that. What?
Sturgeon.
Or a sturgeon, yeah. Sturgeon is a great example of the same class of fish, yeah. Theoretically, this, you find it in fossil layers from a long time ago. We find it today, basically unchanged. Just a species that's done really well for itself and has, in some form, survived up till today. So that's one thing he's illustrating. Another, though, is, if you're looking at this species up here, its evolutionary track history runs something like this zigzag that I've outlined here. When you dig up transitionary fossils, they do not tell you who their grandpas were. They only tell you, here are some bones. That is all they can tell you. And so you are quite possibly, if not almost certainly, digging up these species I've outlined in red here. So if you're saying, if this is whales or some group of whales, and you're looking for what's the transitionary fossils between whales and some land mammal in the distant past, and you find a bunch of fossils in the ground that you think are candidates for that, there's a good chance what you're actually looking at are these ones that aren't technically part of the evolutionary path at all. But they're kind of sort of related from a similar-ish time period. But that's really, and you can't even say that with certainty, but that's likely. If you're just digging up fossils and trying to piece together a puzzle, that's probably what you're doing. That's not usually how it's presented, but that's probably what you're doing. So just a thing worth noting, I think. All right, what transitionary fossils exist? Defining a transitionary fossil is hard. I think it's unfair when certain Christians or certain groups of Christians argue there are no transitionary fossils. There weren't when Darwin is around, and there haven't been any found since then. So it's a big problem for Darwin. Darwin does, in The Origin of Species, call out transitionary fossils as an issue that needs to be addressed. But I don't think it's fair to say there were none, and I definitely don't think it's fair to say there are none, depending on how you define transitionary fossil. We're going to work with a definition that basically says it looks a little bit like the two things it's supposedly connecting. That's the best we can do, because we can't say, again, who this guy's grandpa was, or what his great-great-grandchildren are, or if they're still around, And there's just no way to know that. And so to suggest you can know that is wrong, but to try to deny that this kind of looks maybe like a bird, I think would be a little dishonest as well. You may not be able to see it from there, but if you go and type Archaeopteryx, you'll find the more detailed version of this fossil and many others like it. It does look very dinosaur-like. It has jaws with sharp teeth. not quite like a bird. Birds usually don't have big, sharp teeth for digging in things. 3 clawed fingers. I mean, birds have talons, right? So I don't know if that's exclusively dinosaur-like, but a long, bony tail. That's not bird-like. Birds don't have long tails. Their tails are feathers, and if you sadly ripped out all the feathers, you wouldn't find bones under there. There's not a long, bony structure there. But there was on this guy. Although it does have feathers, so that's kind of bird-like. It has big, broad wings. That's bird-like. It looks like it can fly, probably. Okay, so maybe that's a transitionary fossil. It doesn't paint the whole picture, right? But it suggests that something existed at one point that kind of looked like a dinosaur in certain ways and kind of looked like a bird in other ways. Maybe that's not much. But Tiktaalik, there we go. That's another one in the past couple of, just decade or two, that's made a lot of waves in the evolutionary community, partly for good reason. We'll get to that in a second, but we'll just say it kind of looks like a fish. It's got scales on its back. If you again pull up a picture of it, you can look really closely. It does look like it's got a fish-like body. It's got gills. Apparently, I can't quite see the details, so feel free to pull up research papers and look and see if you really believe those are gills there. It's also got, quote, tetrapod features, i.e. things with 4 feet that would walk on the ground rather than just fins that swim in the water. And that the claim is it has sturdy fin bones. Again, I don't know that I see sturdy fin bones. And I've looked at a good number of different images of this fossil. I'm going to have to take the word for it to some degree and look at the research papers, but I think it's fair to go, show me what's the real evidence for those fin bones. Are they really strong? Are they really there? Does it really look like that thing could at least partly support itself on ground, which is the claim? And it has a flat, wide head with dorsal eyes. That one I actually buy. This one does. It looks like it has a flat, wide head. Okay, I can see that. Whereas fish generally, in both the ancient world and today, have tall, slender heads. That's a little better for the way that they go side to side, swimming through the water. This one had, for whatever reason, kind of flattened out a bit, and its eyes move from the side up top, where if it's on the ground, it's going to be able to see things a little better. That's the argument. So it's a transitionary fossil in that regard. Okay, we're going to focus on that just a little bit longer, because it's actually one of the things that potentially is the most scientific thing you can do with any scientific theory, which is try to prove it wrong. That is what you're supposed to do with theories in science. You kill them. Because that's the only way you actually learn things, is if you kill theories and say, that one's not right, so maybe this one, maybe not. We'll have to keep digging. So the argument was, you look in the fossil record, and at about 390 million years ago, if all of our dating techniques are correct and our understandings of other things are correct, you find tetrapods. You find animals walking around with 4 feet on the ground. And before that, you don't find tetrapods. So somehow animals went from not walking on the ground to walking on the ground around that time period. That's the Upper Devonian, I now know, time period. Okay, so if you wanted to look for something that's kind of halfway between there, you need to look 390 million years ago in the Upper Devonian layers of geology. You need it to be sedimentary rock, and you need it to be something that was shoreline, the transition between water and land, in order to kind of catch them emerging from the sea, if you will. So what places qualified for that? Well, apparently in the very early 2000s or late 1990s, someone, I think it's UPenn, I have to look up his name, but a paleontologist became very famous for this, although I don't remember his name, but looked at basically this exact map. In fact, actually, I happen to know it's this exact map because he has a little lecture he gives. And here he's outlined the Upper Devonian geological layers, so the right time period, that were identified as having water-like fossils and land-like fossils near each other, so it looks like it's shoreline. So these are candidates for finding that stuff. Apparently, this stuff up here in Upper Greenland had been well studied. This stuff outside his backyard in Pennsylvania had been well studied. Nothing transitionary found. But this stuff up here in the very northern reaches of Canada, apparently like a couple hundred miles from the North Pole, that had not been well studied. So yeah, and you might imagine why, right? It's the North Pole. Who wants to go there? Who can go there? But they did, so they got together their funding, they went digging, and sure enough, that is where they found that particular transitionary fossil. So the reason I went through that is because, in theory, the evolutionary theory, if it makes a prediction, The human can cause it to predict if you dig in the right time period and the right type of location. That is where you would expect to find a transitionary fossil. If you exhaustively dig, which is kind of impossible to do as a human, but somehow you exhaustively dug all the sedimentary layers from all of that, and you found nothing that looked even close to a transitionary fossil, in theory, you could count that as a disapproval of evolutionary theory. You could go, well, no, nothing transitioned out of the water. We didn't find any evidence of that. But they did dig, and they did find something that they're arguing looks like a transitionary fossil, and thus, the right scientific statement is they failed to disprove the hypothesis. And that's it. That's how science works. It's much less dramatic and appealing than it's usually presented. But I think we need to be fair about, okay, that's roughly what they tried to do and roughly what they came up with. You could still debate about how much of a transitionary fossil that really is or is not. I think there's loads of questions we could ask each other and potentially cause each other to think harder about those questions. But that is where the digging was done and where they found that.
Did they find multiples? Or
They did find many. That's the most complete, which is, as you could tell, still not particularly complete. I know often incomplete fossils, they try to piecemeal a holistic picture together. Maybe they were able to do that to some degree, and maybe that's somewhat believable. I don't know. But definitely that's the one, if you type in that fossil name, that's the one that pops up because it's like mostly complete or like has some of the critical features. Yes, Buck.
You just gave us an example. Is this one of like 100 or 1,000 examples where scientists found these transitionary fossils, or is this the big
one
piece of evidence that we're using?
That's a good question. I don't know, unfortunately, because I'm not an evolutionary biologist. From what Google tells me, it's one of many, probably not hundreds, maybe 100. And I think all of them are open to some debate, because what I'm about to show you is what they clearly consider the best case. And even that I go, okay, I kind of see it. So all the rest of them are worse than that, worse than what you're about to see, whatever they are. But yeah, totally fair question. Exactly. Like, how frequent is this? Is it every fossil you dig up looks halfway between two other fossils? Or is it 1 in a million that you dig up that you go, oh, maybe that's the link, you know? Very, very fair question. And welcome back, and sorry you're jumping into such a weird Sunday here, Buck, but so glad to have you. All right, so here's a baleen whale. It's got these weird things. We'll call them pelvic bones for lack of a better term for now. The argument is, it used to have legs. If you dig in Egypt is apparently the land of ancient whales. I did not know this, but apparently that's true. You find a chunk of dirt that's 34-ish million years old, and you find this guy who's called Basilosaurus isis. And yeah, okay, he's a nice, long, whale-ish looking thing. And you can't see it here, but I've zoomed in to the legs that were recovered as part of this exact fossil. And that's what they look like. And I go, oh yeah, that's not just a pelvis, it's got little leggy things too. Okay. It's legit, like, okay, you told me that's a leg, I'd go, that probably looks like a leg. One of the other claims, right, from mammals on the ground, usually breathing with their nose to the ground, maybe they need to smell something on the ground, and that's where their nostrils end up. Whales in the water, they have to poke their head straight up out of the water, take a deep breath and go back down. It'd be much easier if they could have their spout up on the top of their head. So the argument is, oh, surely there must have been some species where it's halfway between, right? And there's a different fossil called Durodon atrox from a slightly older time period, 30 or 40 million years ago. So here's a coyote out in the front. Here's a harbor porpoise, similar to a whale in that regard. Or you could put a whale head there and find the same thing, that the holes are on the top of the head. And okay, yeah, there's a nose hole there halfway-ish. I don't know how compelling I actually find that, but okay, I'll admit it's halfway up the nose thing. But there you go. So there's a transition is the argument. Yes, Jeffrey.
And again, they have more than one case of the middle.
Yes, more than one case in the middle. I don't think there's a nice linear progression from what I could tell. It kind of hops around a bit. But is it always at the front and then boom, it's at the back? No. It migrates a bit, it seems.
Sounds like they're kind of maybe conveniently dating that a little bit younger than the one that we were looking at before.
Yes.
It's like, you really tell that close of millions of years?
That's a good question. I don't know for sure. Yeah, I'll have to just punt on that.
I mean, I know it's all theoretical
Yeah.
period, but just wondering.
What's the number of fossils that we're talking about? Like, you seem to have a lot of dinosaurs.
It's a hand for many of these. It's a handful for these
So,
specific
wouldn't
species.
it make sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you have a lot of animals from this? Shouldn't you have a lot of animals from like
a lot of them.
every time period, right? Like if you
This is something we'll get to at the end. Hopefully, if we move fast. But it's called punctuated equilibrium. Is the term assigned to that problem?
got a good band name.
But I know, right? Da-na-na-na, punctuate. Da-na-na. Yeah. Anyway, but basically, there's an acknowledgement in the evolutionary community that like evolution is very nonlinear. It is step function-esque. You find these little bits here and there and go, oh, maybe that was halfway between. But there's many steps maybe, but it looks like steps more than a gradual, blurry progression. And evolutionary biologists go, that's not a problem. We'll give it a name. That name will be punctuated equilibrium. It is now known that that is how biology and evolution proceeds. I don't think that's really great science, but anyway, we'll get to that point in a little bit. But yes, that's fair. That there's not a lot. Yes.
And maybe the last question. Like when they find these fossils, they're somewhat or quite a bit deteriorated when they get it.
Yes.
So they have to interpolate an awful lot.
Yes. Yeah.
So like what kind of like level of like honesty,
Yeah.
you know, because every scientist wants to discover the missing link, right?
The perfect pristine fossil that just connects it all together. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, so like how like
Oh, I see.
like how much integrity do
Yes.
these guys
No,
exercise?
there is a lot of course, there's a lot of incentive to have discovered an important transitionary fossil, even if that's not what you've really discovered. I tried to scrutinize this stuff as best I could. I'm not a biologist, so I have to throw that out there that I'm not like really super qualified to evaluate fossils. But like, that's why I search for examples like those hind legs where I go, I buy it, that's a leg, and it's attached to something that's long and bendy like a whale. Okay.
How much of that was interpolation, right?
That particular case, I mean, like this is the fossil for this one.
Okay.
It's like nearly full set of legs and a pretty complete skeleton otherwise. So like in this case, I'd go, not a lot of interpolation, but in many other cases, yeah, it is a lot of interpolation. That's why this becomes the poster child, right? Because you have to guess a little less. Okay, so Durodon atrox, same one we just saw the nose halfway up. This is its full skeleton, and this is its legs. Some of this, I think if you dig in, some of this is reconstruction, but the evidence for the legs, I think, is pretty strong. Okay, Ambulocetus natans, ambulo like ambulance or ambulatory, so it walks, and cetus like cetacean, like whale, it's a walking whale. That's what they named it. But anyway, here's the fossil remains. Okay, definitely some interpolation needs to be done here, right? This is what you actually find on the ground. And I know, because I found enough pictures of this, that they were clearly still guessing which bits and pieces went on the left and the right. So they've, I think, tried to assemble one full leg out of this.
That's one thing I was wondering, if even with your Archaeopteryx guy,
Yeah.
can you even say for sure that that's all one fossil? I mean, really, it's all there, but there's no bird not sitting on top of a reptile, you know? It's just like,
Yeah. I think for Archaeopteryx, there's enough very similar examples that it would seem awfully coincidental if that's the case. Because that one's not just one. That one we actually have a good number of. But yeah, for ones like this, like it's a one-off, it's a little disjointed, you gotta make sense of it. And like if you're an honest paleontologist, you do your best. But the incentives for dishonesty are there, for sure. That you just have to acknowledge the incentives are there. That doesn't mean they did it wrong, it just means the incentives are there. Okay, so anyway, best guess at reconstruction looks like this, apparently. And you know, like, okay, if these really are all digit bones, okay. And if those really are like femurs and tibia and fibia, okay, they're definitely longer looking on the whole than the previous one. And so look, it's like half rat, half whale. Big long legs, but like long digits that could maybe paddle it along, almost like an otter. That's usually what people throw in here. Like, oh, like an otter. It's got these like big webbed feet, but it's got feet, not a whale tail, right? So it propels itself through the water in part with that. Okay, so what did we just see? Well, here's what, if you go into a textbook, you know, there's several more fossils that they point to. A lot of them are land dwelling, so I don't consider them particularly relevant because the big question is like, how do you go from land to water, not what came right before you went into the water. But this is what's presented. And on the left, I don't know if you can see it, but it's a nice, clean looking like progression, right? And I understand that. That's what they want to do. And that's making their case. But like, it's important to bear in mind, that's not what you just saw. This is what you just saw, right? You pulled fossils that you don't know what their ancestors were. All you can say is that, yeah, legs on creatures that look a little bit like whales in the past looked like they were a little bit longer and now are basically gone. Maybe that was how things progressed. But that's really all you can say, because fossils don't tell you who their ancestors are. The other thing is, oh yeah, this Basilosaurus isis, the one we started with in Egypt, that's a little bit longer than the Durodon atrox. All right, but they're like related, right? No. Well, maybe, I don't know, but that's them to scale. One of them is 20 meters long and one is 4 meters long. They're vastly different in size. And when you scale them that way, I think their legs are proportionately about the same. I don't know that I do see much of a difference between one and the other. Like, sure, bigger legs, but bigger animal, you know? So.
Can they date them as far as like the age of the animal?
Well, that was what we tried to present, was that, and again, I don't know all the details for why they would date.
Do you mean like a baby version?
Yeah.
Oh, how old? I see, the age of the animal in its developmental cycle. So that was originally some of the suggestions. I think some of these got lumped into like, oh, it's one species, just this is a baby one and this is not. Why they broke it up now and say that I think these are different species, very fair question, and I don't know the specifics. Hopefully there was something specific.
Like you said, there's lots of questions.
But there's lots of questions and maybe some interpretation. Well, always there's interpretation.
Just real quick, maybe you covered this at the beginning. I'm sorry. It's like there is evidence of big sea creatures in the Bible, right? I mean, it does talk about it.
The Leviathan.
Right. So I mean, I feel like this is not
Crazy.
dissonant.
Yeah.
It's not,
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I was just thinking that when I was thinking.
Sure.
So there's oh man, there's so much we could say there.
Yeah,
I'll say the Bible certainly none of this seems discordant with the Bible insofar as large creatures in the sea totally jives. No problems there, right? The real question is just, are some of those creatures, did they used to be land mammals that have now evolved? And if they did, is that discordant with the Bible's claim? I think that's the only point I'm trying to address.
Yeah.
Loads of questions we can talk about later on the Leviathan issue. Because yeah, everyone loves a good Leviathan story. But but anyway, yes, Paula.
I'd also say, without knowing the editors of the text, there could be intention and there could be just convenience
Yes.
of making the textbook. Because
Exactly.
if you make them to scale in that picture,
It's
you might
hard to
not
read,
be
it
able to
doesn't
even
make
see the
sense.
4 meter guy.
Exactly.
No, and so I'm not necessarily trying to attribute negative or dishonesty on the side of this textbook. Maybe.
Yeah, maybe,
But-
but in either case, it leads to misunderstanding.
Exactly. But it's easy to look at that and go, wow, what a beautiful progression. It's so clean and clear. But that could just be an artifact of the convenience aspect. Yep, absolutely. I've made enough science-y charts to know that sometimes convenience wins, because that's how you got to present the information. So yeah. Anyway, one final line of evidence we'll consider DNA. Just a quick refresher. Deoxyribonucleic acid, that is our genes. That's theoretically the information that tells our bodies how to build up and stuff. Matt made a great point about recent work on epigenetics that suggests that environment really does matter and how those genes get expressed. Potentially that gene expression, I don't understand the microbiology exactly of how that goes, but it can be transmitted. In particular, there's been studies, correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, but studies on trauma in males from wartime, that as a result of their trauma, they die early, and that their sons apparently inherit that and get certain genes turned on that are harmful to them. So a tragic story, but something that suggests, yes, environment does matter. But from the evolutionist's perspective, what they ultimately care about is, where's the information? Where's that code that tells me how to build these proteins and these structures, and how is it changing, if at all, over time? So that's here in the DNA. You got your chromosome, which is one long strand of this double helix acid. And then the latter rungs there, the nucleotide bases, those are adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. Those are your letters. You get 4 letters to spell an alphabet. It's so close to a binary computer, it's absurd. If only for some reason our computers had been quaternary instead of binary, the analogy would be almost perfect, but it's not. So anyway, you get 4 letters and you get to spell out codes for amino acids. And that's basically it. A certain string of ATs, Cs, and Gs will tell your body, here's how to build this particular amino acid. Or sorry, actually, a set of 3 tells it how to build an amino acid. A long strand of them tells it how to build many amino acids together, i.e. a protein. So that's what DNA is trying to do. A single gene to build, for now it's not quite right, but we'll say a single gene to build a single protein has what we call exons and introns. Exons are the part that get pulled out and copied and translated into protein. Introns are the parts that don't get translated. And correct me again if I'm wrong here, Matt, but I think the current understanding is that part kind of doesn't matter.
It's this emoji.
Yeah, it's the hand shrug emoji. There we go. Thanks, Matt. Thanks. It's I don't know what's going on there, but it looks like you can mess with it, and it doesn't mess up the protein, so no harm, no foul. If a mutation occurs there, it doesn't really have an impact because it doesn't change your protein. Okay, the reason I bring that up is because if this genetic information is being transmitted and slowly modified each time by processes somewhat identified maybe, somewhat unidentified maybe, then neo-Darwinian theory of evolution claims that random mutations should cause a specific genetic sequence to slowly change over time. All right, let's make it an if-then so we can disprove it. If species A is more closely related to species B than it is to species C, then the homologous genetic sequence, i.e., we're going to look at the case of the genetic sequence that says, here's how to build insulin. You look at that in those different species. And the ones for A and B, if they're really, quote, more closely related, you'd think should be more similar. And the ones for A and C, if they're less closely related, should have had more time for especially for those introns that, quote, don't matter. They can wiggle around in all kinds of directions, and there shouldn't be any force that says, well, they died because that intron got screwed up. It shouldn't have mattered. And so that should be allowed to wiggle around, and you should see more wiggling changes between those 2 species, A and C, instead of A and B. Okay, that's the hypothesis, the if-then. If you go and look at the genetic evidence and you pick a set of species that we think from other reasons, we go, I think these are more closely related. We'll pick an ape and we'll pick a human. We'll go, the classic evolutionary claim. Those 2 are more closely related. And you look at insulin specifically, the insulin gene, and you line them up, A, T, C's, and G's all the way down, and they're not identical, but 98% of the letters agree. They're the same. 2% are different. All right, now take that human insulin genome and take the chicken's insulin gene. You line those up. You can line them up, but there's using metrics that I did not look at specifically, so I have to take whoever I found online at their word, but that 64% of those letters agree, but the remaining 36 do not. So that fails to disprove the hypothesis. And that's what we can say. Quick pause. I think we can do it, but we got to do a quick pause. Any final thoughts or questions? I know that was it. That's the best case for evolution I think you can make at its essence. There's a lot more details you could go into, but I think those would be the core lines of evidence. Yes, Jeffrey.
Everything I've read on this, they make a distinction between like what people call today evolution and then natural selection.
Okay, yep.
And natural selection, I don't think many people would debate that occurs, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you see that on a very small scale. But then the evolution, they kind of conflate the two ideas and say that they must be the same. When they're really not. One has a lot more problems, and natural selection has a lot fewer.
Yeah. I agree. I think most people it makes sense from the example we looked at last week. The faster lions catch gazelles. The faster gazelles escape the lions. Both the faster ones win, right? Like you want to be faster if you're either a predator or a prey, say. The question is that force strong enough to cause one species to somehow split into 2? And the genetics, I didn't have enough time to dig in to educate myself enough that I felt confident I'd be truthful with you or accurate with you. about the challenges that genetics presents to that idea. But I think there are both, the genetics give the evolutionary biologist something to look at and go, this is what's changing. But it also, I think, presents some challenges as well in terms of understanding how the changes can produce the results they claim they do. A very fair distinction, Jeffrey. Yeah. Okay, evidence against evolution. Remember, way back from our philosophy of science one, falsifiability. That's the core idea. If it's a scientific claim, it has to be falsifiable. You have to be able to prove it false somehow. You can't prove it true. And you can't really prove it. Prove is still the wrong word. But you have to demonstrate somehow that it's probably false based on the examination of physical evidence. So, first point I'm going to make is the necessity of interpretation. Data do not speak for themselves. That's the thing. Oh, let the data speak for themselves. That's not a thing. That doesn't happen. Data never speak for themselves. Humans speak for data. They always have to impose an interpretation on the data. The number 3 just is, and that bone just was. There may be some interpretations that get ruled out quickly because they don't make sense, but you still have to impose an interpretation on the data. And my concern, well, basically what we're going to unpack is that my concern is that naturalistic, I'll say naturalistic, evolution, sometimes it seems like it's too flexible to falsify. That almost any circumstance you present to the evolutionary biologist, they'll go, oh yeah, that makes sense. Even if it isn't exactly what they were expecting before. And that's fine, theories change, but if they change under infinite stress, then what could possibly falsify the theory? And that's just my concern. I'm not saying it necessarily is the case. I think there's a few key examples. In particular, there's the fact that interpretation you have to provide, that's subjective. It's not an objective interpretation. It can't be. And that thus, almost any characteristic you observe in a population, the evolutionary biologist will almost certainly claim, with very few exceptions, oh yeah, they have that because that offered them a competitive advantage. And if you point at a characteristic and go, how is that a competitive advantage? like brightly colored feathers on a bird. And yeah, okay, maybe it is sexual selection, that's the argument. Basically, you got to be a big, brave boy bird who survives all the dangerous predators. And with your brightly colored feathers, you're showing, even though the predators can easily find me, I survived. So I'm a big, brave boy bird. And thus, you should mate with me, right? That's the sorry, Buck, you can't handle it. But that's the argument. And maybe that's fine, but my concern is that no matter what evidence you present that suggests this doesn't seem like it's offering a competitive advantage, you can just kind of come up with an interpretation where it does offer some kind of competitive advantage. In which case, yeah, well then, is this really a scientific idea? Because you got to be able to falsify it. There has to be something specific you could go observe that would go, that theory's false. And if you can't do that, then it's an idea, but it's not a scientific claim. Okay, so we're going to start actually with the life is assumed to have started naturally because, well, life exists. We know there's no God, right? So that's why life is here. All right, so kick-starting life.
Jordan,
yes.
Play the other side.
Yes.
Didn't you point out early that if you found, and it would be a hard experiment to do, if you searched all the areas where you were looking for transitional fossil, that would be a falsifiable. Not that it's possible. It's possible. Not that it's feasible.
Yeah.
But at least it would be falsifiable.
Theoretically. So I'm going to agree with you and then also disagree with you. The agreement is if you had infinite bulldozers and you could dig all the dirt, which we can't, right? But so from a practical standpoint, no, we can't dig all the dirt. From a theoretical standpoint, yeah, we could dig all the dirt. And if you found no transitions, we falsified. Darwin noticed this and addresses it in The Origin of Species. And that his argument is basically, the reason we have so few transitionary fossils, in his day especially, is because fossils are rare. Most things die without getting fossilized. So, there's my escape clause already. And he also noticed that this punctuated equilibrium thing was maybe starting to rear its face. And so he suggested, transitions are brief. And so And he gives a reasoning for why he suspects that might be the case or something. I don't know. But I think he has a valid point to make. But his point, my point is simply that like even Darwin understood that like the transitionary fossil thing is a threat to the theory. I don't think he was trying to be dishonest about that. But then he came up with 2 reasons why, if you don't find very many transitions, that makes sense. In which case, if you dig all the dirt and you find no transitions, is that a falsification? Or can you just explain it away with, well, they're rare and they're brief, and so I guess we just didn't get any. Maybe the scientific community would handle that differently than I would expect, but I'm a little concerned that the way they'd handle it would be to raise those exact 2 issues and not accept it as a, quote, falsification. But anyway, fair point that, yeah, if you dug and you found absolutely no transitionary fossils of any kind anywhere, in that case, you probably wouldn't even have a theory of evolution in the first place, right? You just go, everything looks the same all the time everywhere. And so what's this evolution thing you're talking about?
Right. Well, plus the sedimentary layers are not everything is a sedimentary layer that's going to record all of history.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the conditions have to be just right to create those fossils, yeah. Okay, this slide is a very long-winded way basically of going, yeah, I think going from chemical soup to living organism is a big challenge. I don't see the path. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but right now it only exists in the human imagination, right? It is not a known thing that you can go from point A to B there. And it seems to me that, yeah, it seems really improbable in certain ways. I'll just say that. Partly, I think that's a valid point because if you go way back to, especially if you go way back to Darwin, the understanding of the cell was rudimentary at best. They thought it was a plasma goo. Plasma's the wrong word, but a little goo stuff with, some life energy in it, basically.
The simple cell.
The simple cell, whereas they did not understand all the microbiology that was going on in there. That all has to be there, or at least some basic form of it all has to be there. So to now for us to go, wow, I don't know if you can go from point A to B if it's not just living goo cell that you need to make. It's like a whole machine factory you need to make. It seems like a more valid counterpoint today with that knowledge. Earlier, they were a lot more optimistic, right? Nothing indicates, however, that at present that artificial production of living matter is beyond the possibilities of science. We must succeed in producing living matter artificially, or we must find the reasons why this is impossible. Kind of a nice little optimistic scientist there saying, yeah, we'll just make some living goo. I think just underappreciating how complicated individual cells really are. This has been an active area of research. People try to reproduce this, whether in the form of a simple single cell that they kind of piece together from pre-existing cells, or in some cases trying to actually do that transition from chemical soup to living cell. They all don't really work. There's some evidence that, yeah, if you kind of mechanical engineer a cell out of other cell parts, that maybe you can get something going. But if that's what it takes to get a cell going, at this point, I think all you can really show is, yes, with a human in the loop actually intentionally doing this stuff, then you can get a living organism. But it doesn't show that it happens on its own naturally. I think you need to create conditions that are plausible and just life emerges.
And again, you just created one cell. Good luck with it.
Good luck with the rest of it, yeah.
Yeah, with it keeping going, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think there's a long way to go on that front if that bridge is ever bridgeable. There's other issues like the Cambrian explosion. This is probably the first instance that creates this punctuated equilibrium idea, where before something called the Cambrian explosion, you just don't really get many fossils. There's a couple explanations for this. Why about 530 million years ago, suddenly, boom, in the span of a few million years, there's loads and loads of species. Perhaps the appearance of oxygen. That's one argument. Oh, now you can build bigger animals because now there's plant life on land, which maybe doesn't get fossilized so easily, but it's out there and it's converting carbon dioxide to oxygen. Now you can get bigger animals. So that's why suddenly you got all these new animals you didn't have before. Perhaps they evolved shells and skeletons. And those fossilized real well. So that's why now we have all these fossils, where before we didn't. Or either way, it's considered an example of, quote, punctuated equilibrium, where it's just boom, there's this relatively rapid transition kind of across the board in terms of the biology of Earth. I'm just going to point out, or it could be something else, like potentially this could be considered evidence that, yeah, that maybe is too rapid of a transition and too broad of a transition. I think the onus is on the evolutionary theorists to somehow show that's not too rapid, not too broad. And that's a big task for them as well. Maybe a surmountable one, but I'd understand if someone goes, wow, that seems awfully rapid compared to much of the other evolutionary transitions we observe over dozens and dozens of millions of years. Okay, another issue is that falsifiability is that modern science effectively seems to assume naturalism. And to a certain degree, I think it should, because that's kind of the point of science. It works within a naturalistic framework because it's meant to describe naturally occurring things. So if you witness a miracle and then you bust out your beakers and you're like, let's do this, let's reproduce that miracle, you're not going to, right? Science is the wrong tool set for that, and you're not going to reproduce that miracle. The issue is that means that if there really was something unnatural or supernatural that ever did occur, especially as it pertains to the history of life on Earth, you can't figure that out using science. And the logical error, I think it's a logical error, is that you effectively assume that any theory of life, including a supernatural element, must necessarily be wrong. As anytime you say, oh, well, maybe this is something that, in fact, you run up against as a wall in science. And the argument is, well, no, it can't be, because that means science can't explain it. And we can't have that, right? We can't have a gap that we didn't fill. This does lead to a different problem, something called God of the gaps, where everything you don't know how to explain yet, you go, well, it must be God. And then the power and might of your God shrinks as science continues to explain things. I think that's a problem. You shouldn't just look at everything you don't understand and say it must be God. However, if in fact there is supernatural things that have happened in the world, biology being just one example of the many claims the Bible makes, right? Then you should expect there to be a gap. You wouldn't be able to explain that because there does not exist a natural explanation. As Christians, we read the Bible and we go, we think this is an accurate recording of some kind of intervention from God on Earth. So we think that something supernatural happened here. But it's not because we looked at the science and go, well, I ran into a wall, must have been a miracle. So I think we come at it from the other direction. Finally, my sense is that evolutionary theory, as much as I'm personally potentially okay with certain aspects of it, it seems to be treated like dogma. This particular statement, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. I don't think that statement is necessarily true. I can understand how evolution might be like an overarching theory that kind of pieces together a lot of disparate parts of biological study. I can see that. But to say that nothing makes sense doesn't mean you can't be a fantastic botanist or a fantastic microbiologist in every other regard. Even if you go, this particular microbiological thing I'm working on, I don't think it evolved the way that current theory thinks it evolved. I think you could still be a pretty good biologist and not assent to this statement. And the problem, I think, is that the implication is, well, if you don't get on board the evolution train, you're not a real biologist. So, you're not in our camp. I think that as a culture is really damaging to good debate and scientific investigation. I think on the astronomy side, we face a similar problem with the Big Bang Theory. I think the evidence for the Big Bang Theory is a little cleaner, just in its simplicity. But if you were ever to challenge it in any way, you'd be kicked out of town in no time. So you're not going to pursue a long-term professional career in astronomy if you're not willing to just kind of get on board the Big Bang train. Anyway, I think that's a problem culturally in the sciences. Okay, irreducible complexity. This is a concept that's been raised as a potential issue for evolution, where if you look at a system and it looks like if you just took one of those parts of that system away, the whole system wouldn't confer any kind of competitive advantage. And thus, how could that system just gradually evolve? I think it has a lot of merits to it. I think it's also sometimes misunderstood, and there are some potential counter arguments to it. But I think it raises a legitimate question, and that something like a bacterium's flagellum that propels it along, you need the tail to be built, you need the motors to be run, you need all of the enzymes to drive the motors to be there. And if any one of the dozens or so parts of the bacterium flagellum isn't functioning just right, then all you do, you're just a bacteria with a long tail that doesn't work. Once you get that tail going, you can zip around the world and find food anywhere you want. That's a huge advantage. But it's potentially a step function that maybe it's too challenging to go over naturally. Maybe God intervenes and kicks it over that step function, no problem. But that's the claim, basically. So my concluding thoughts is that the onus is on the theoretician. In good scientific practice, I think, the onus is on the theoretician to provide the tests. The theoreticians are supposed to be out there saying, I think this theory is really good. And if you want to help me demonstrate its decentness as a theory, go try to disprove it with the following experiments, or the following dig sites, or the following observations. And then when you go do those things, if you fail to falsify my theory, it's potentially a good theory. I don't think that seems to be the culture surrounding evolution. I think more so the culture is kind of protect evolution from critique. I just don't think that's the right way to do science. I think it's because of the naturalism. Because evolution provides a naturalistic explanation whereby you can delete God from your equations. And now you're not accountable to God. You can potentially even, there's political issues, like you can ridicule religious groups and go, well, see, they've got the wrong morals. The morals that I've always thought are wrong, it's because this wackadoo group made up those morals, and now they're forcing them on everyone else or whatever. And I'm now justified in my opposition to that because there is no God, really. And I can still explain everything without God. So yeah, I think that's my hunch. It could be wrong. Obviously, that's just a hunch, but my hunch is it seems like that's the case. The movie I skipped, if you want to stick around and watch it later, it is very interesting because there's a biologist attacking irreducible complexity. And you can just kind of see the upsettedness with which he does that. It does not come across as dispassionate biological science. Wow, that was yet another big episode. I appreciate you sticking it through to the end on this one as well. As I said before, this episode will be uploaded to our new website at atigtpodcast.com. So feel free to check it out there, as well as some of the graphics that I was commenting on throughout the episode. Feel free to follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/atigtpodcast, where we really will start hopefully ramping up our posting both about new episodes and some additional background content. We'd also really appreciate it if you shared this with a friend if you found it interesting and thought they might too. One way or another, we appreciate your support, and we hope you'll join us again next week. Bye.